The peripheral nervous system consists of all neural structures outside the brain and spinal cord. It provides links to and from the external environment. And the peripheral nervous system includes afferent receptors and efferent receptors. Afferent receptors are the sensory receptors that are going to the central nervous system, and the efferent receptors are the motor endings that are going from the central nervous system. The afferent receptors, or the sensory receptors, are specialized to respond to certain stimuli. We have exteroceptors and interoceptors. Exteroceptors are going to respond to stimuli from outside the body, and those would include our special sense organs. Interoceptors respond to stimuli from within the body, and so those would be found in the internal viscera, which are your organs, and the blood vessels. There are 5 specific types of afferent receptors. Mechanoreceptors are your tactile receptors that respond to touch, pressure, vibration, stretch, and itch. Thermoreceptors will respond to changes in temperature. Photoreceptors respond to light energy. Chemoreceptors respond to a change in chemicals. And nociceptors respond to pain-causing stimuli. Nociceptors are located in all body locations except the brain itself. So while the brain can perceive pain in parts of the body, the brain itself cannot feel or have the sensation of pain. So this is just a chart that is going through the different receptors, what the stimuli is, and the locations that they can be found in. Adaptation of sensory receptors. This is when sensory receptors are subjected to an unchanging stimulus. The stimulus continues, so it's still there, but neurons cease to fire. And that's because receptors become less responsive to constant stimulation of the same input. Our nervous system wants to react and recalibrate to changing stimuli. So if the stimulus is unchanging, that does not seem to be important enough to the brain to pay attention to anymore. But if stimuli changes, that's when our brain will start to pay attention. The evolutionary purpose of adaptation of sensory receptors is to conserve energy used by the brain, and it will only process important or changes in sensory input. This prevents sensory overload so that you're not constantly being exposed to every stimulus in your environment, only the stimuli that are changing. Adaptation curves for different senses vary. So we have different adaptation abilities with different senses. The senses that have very fast adaptation would be your cutaneous mechanoreceptors and thermoreceptors, your olfactory and gustatory chemoreceptors, and your photoreceptors. Slow adaptation would be the chemoreceptors in the blood. And nociceptors do not exhibit adaptation. And that's because pain is a sign that something is wrong. And the nervous system is going to be continually responsive to that because that's a signal that something needs to be addressed. There's injury, there is disease, something along those lines. So some examples of adaptation of sensory receptors: you no longer notice an odor that you initially smelled. When you put your arms on a table, but after a while, you're not noticing the feeling of the table anymore. Getting used to the humming of an air conditioner, getting used to the temperature of water, and no longer feeling your clothes on your skin or your shoes on your feet. Here's an example of adaptation of sensory receptors. It's called the Troxler fading effect. When fixating on a particular point, an unchanging stimulus away from the fixation point will fade away and disappear. So if you look at those points in the center of each image, the surrounding images will eventually disappear. Sensory habituation is a learned voluntary behavior, and this is when we actively attempt to ignore a stimuli. Sensory adaptation is different than sensory habituation, and this is really understood through the example of our nociceptors. Remember, we do not experience adaptation with our nociceptors. They do not become less responsive or receptive to stimuli. However, you can experience habituation to a certain degree. You can choose to ignore or push through the pain. So the pain is there, but you may have the ability to kind of block it out. And then we have divisions of the nervous system. So we have our two main divisions of the nervous system, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system has many different divisions within itself. The two main divisions of the peripheral nervous system are the sensory division and the motor division. The sensory division is what carries impulses from the body to the brain. So this would be the receptive structures, for example, your eyes, your ears, your skin, and the afferent neurons that are then going to send those signals to the brain. When we talk about our special senses, we'll be focusing on that sensory division. The other division is the motor division, and the motor division transmits impulses from the brain to the body. So that includes the efferent neurons and the effector structures. Now, the motor division can also be further subdivided. So the two subdivisions of the motor system is the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. The somatic nervous system controls voluntary actions, so the activities you consciously choose to do. And the somatic nervous system innervates skeletal muscles. Now, reflexes are included in the somatic nervous system. Even though reflexes are an automatic response, because that response involves skeletal muscles, reflexes are put into the somatic nervous system category. The autonomic nervous system controls involuntary actions and innervates our viscera. So, like our stomach digesting food, our brain functioning, and doing all of the things that the brain needs to do. So, all of that is involuntary. We subconsciously are doing all of those without having to actually think about it. And then the autonomic nervous system can also be further subdivided into two divisions. So autonomic nervous system has the parasympathetic division and the sympathetic division. The parasympathetic division is kind of the normal situation. This is when our body is conserving energy. It promotes housekeeping functions during rest. This is when everything is okay, normal, kind of the default situation. The sympathetic division is how our autonomic system is going to function under stress or under extreme activity. And that's going to change how all of those unconscious autonomic activities actually function. So, a lot of times, the parasympathetic division is considered the rest and digest stage, and the sympathetic division is the fight or flight stage. So these are some really good examples of how the autonomic system functions and then how the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system differ.